There's a phrase most of us have heard our whole lives: old wives' tales. We use it almost without thinking, usually to dismiss some piece of folk wisdom or superstition. But where does that phrase actually come from? The history behind those three words turns out to be more revealing and more charged than it might initially seem. Hi everyone, my name is Jessica Lakin. Thank you for taking the time to listen to my podcast. The phrase old wives' tale first appeared in English writing in the mid 1500s during the upheaval of the Protestant Reformation. Protestant reformers had a clear mission. They wanted to draw a sharp line between what they considered true religious knowledge, grounded in scripture, studied by scholars, and delivered from the pulpit, and many customs, rituals, and stories that had long circulated in everyday life. To dismiss those traditions, writers reached for a phrase from the Latin Bible, Aniles fabulae, meaning old women's stories. By the 1500s, or 1540s rather, the English version had taken hold, old wives' tales, a shorthand for beliefs considered irrational or unworthy of serious attention. The wording was not accidental. In early modern English, wife simply meant woman. Invoking old wives' tales signaled that this knowledge did not come from scholars or clergy. Instead, it came from elderly women passing along stories in kitchens, marketplaces, and village gatherings. And because it came from those spaces, it was treated as something that did not count. Over time, the phrase drifted away from its Reformation origins. By the 18th century, it referred more broadly to folk remedies, household rituals, pregnancy advice, weather lore, and other forms of practical knowledge passed down through generations. The theological argument faded, but the dismissiveness still remained. What the phrase continued to encode was a longer pattern of gendered knowledge. Traditions that circulated through women's networks through caregiving, storytelling, healing, and everyday spirituality were labeled superstition precisely because they existed outside formal institutions, outside of the church, outside of university, and outside the emerging scientific establishment. The knowledge itself was real, but the people carrying it did not possess the credentials those institutions recognized. So, what did that knowledge actually look like? Historians and folklorists often describe many of these traditions as forms of domestic divination, small scale practices for interpreting signs and seeking guidance through ordinary experience. Women were frequently associated with interpreting dreams, reading omens in nature, predicting weather patterns, or using household rituals to seek guidance about health, fertility, and relationships. These practices were not fringe activities, they were woven into the texture of everyday life. Take pregnancy predictions, for example. For centuries, women passed down methods for reading signs in the body, the shape of a pregnant belly, particular food cravings, or the way a wedding ring might swing when suspended on a thread. Modern medicine dismisses these practices, often for good reason, but what they reveal is something meaningful. Women using observation and shared experience to interpret patterns in the body and the natural world. That knowledge circulated through conversation and community rather than written scholarship, which meant it rarely appeared in the kinds of texts that institutions preserved. Dream interpretation worked similarly. In many early modern communities, dreams were believed to carry spiritual weight, warning, messages, or signs about the future. Women shared interpretations and developed a kind of collective literacy around symbols and meaning. These interpretations rarely appeared in theological writings, but they circulated widely in households and between neighbors. In societies where official religious roles were almost entirely reserved for men, these practices offered women a form of spiritual participation and interpretive authority. The church had its priests, universities had their scholars, women had domestic spaces, the kitchen, the garden, the community gathering, and within those spaces they developed their own ways of making meaning. This history also helps explain something about the present. Practices like tarot reading, astrology, and crystal work are open to anyone today, but they remain culturally associated with women. That association is often described as something modern, a product of wellness culture, social media aesthetics, or recent spiritual trends, but it may be part of a much longer pattern. These practices emphasize personal interpretation, symbolism, and intuition rather than institutional authority. In that sense, they operate within the same interpretive framework that women worked within for centuries in domestic and community settings. The tools may be different, and the cultural context has changed, but the underlying pattern remains recognizable. The phrase old wives' tale was always meant to end a conversation, to signal that what followed was not worth taking seriously. But historically, it was doing something more specific. It marked a tradition of women's knowledge as illegitimate, not necessarily because the knowledge itself was wrong, but because of who carried it and where it circulated outside institutions, outside official texts, in everyday life. That tradition never disappeared, it adapted. And the next time someone dismisses a tarot reading or an astrology chart as just another old wives' tale, they are continuing a much older argument, one that has never really been about superstition at all. It has always been about whose knowledge counts. Thanks so much for listening. I've linked the sources and further readings that informed this episode if you'd like to explore the topic in more detail.